Most people think spiritual danger announces itself loudly. They imagine chaos, visible darkness, dramatic moments that force belief. That assumption is exactly why so many households remain unguarded. Because the most effective attacks never arrive as emergencies. They arrive as normal days, as tired evenings, as quiet arguments that feel harmless, as distractions that seem reasonable. I know this because for years I studied patterns most believers never think to question. Not to scare you, but to tell you something very few Christians are prepared to hear. Your home is not targeted because you are weak, sinful, or failing. It is targeted because it is significant. And significance never advertises itself until it becomes a problem to someone else. What you are about to hear is not something shared in sermons, not because it isn't biblical, but because it makes people uncomfortable. It removes the illusion that faith is passive. It exposes that protection is not automatic simply because you believe. And once you see this, you can unsee it. That is why most people never talk about it. But if you clicked on this, it's because something in you already sensed that there is more happening behind the scenes than what you were taught. You've felt it in your home, in the atmosphere, in moments you could explain. That quiet pressure, that strange resistance, that sense that peace slips away faster than it should. This conversation is not for entertainment. It's not even for inspiration. It is for awareness. And once awareness arrives, responsibility follows. That is the part many avoid because ignorance feels safer than accountability. But ignorance never stopped an attack. It only delayed understanding it. And there's a reason this knowledge creates discomfort before it creates peace. Before I go any further, understand this if you are someone who wants comfortable faith, surface-level answers, and explanations that never challenge your assumptions. This channel is not for you. What I share here is what most believers only learn after years of confusion. If you don't want to learn these things too late, if you don't want to be constantly reacting instead of discerning, then make sure you subscribe. Not because of algorithms, not because of content, but because what is planned against believers does not pause while they stay uninformed. Staying ahead is always required listening before the crisis, not during it. I speak carefully about my past, not because it gives me status, but because it gives context. There was a time when my responsibility was observation, analysis, studying belief systems, prayer habits, family structures, and spiritual rhythms. Not from a place of faith, but from a place of strategy. I learned very quickly that darkness does not waste energy on chaos. It studies order. It does attack loud Christians who make noise but carry no depth. It watches the quiet ones. The households where prayer is sincere, where peace matters, where children are covered, where alignment exists, even imperfectly. Those homes create resistance, and resistance attracts attention. I was involved in assignments where the goal was never possession, never horror, never spectacle. The goal was erosion, delay, fatigue, confusion, separation. If peace could be thinned slowly, protection weakened naturally, and authority left unused, the work was considered successful. No drama required. One mission in particular exposed something that still unsettles me. We monitored multiple Christian households over time. Same faith, same church, same teachings. Yet some homes remained inexplicably untouched, while others faced repeated cycles of disruption. It was morality that made the difference. It was church attendance. It was even consistency. It was knowledge, specific knowledge that created spiritual jurisdiction, whether the people understood it fully or not. Certain names spoken with alignment altered boundaries, not as incantations, not as rituals, but as acknowledgments of authority structures that predate human systems. Those homes did panic when pressure came. They did scramble. They did escalate emotionally. The atmosphere simply shifted, and when that happened, assignments stalled. Access closed. Influence diminished. That was when I realized something crucial. The dark kingdom fears informed believers far more than passionate ones. Most Christians believe protection is something God automatically enforces without participation. That belief is comforting, but incomplete. Scripture is filled with delegated authority, not passive shielding. Households were always meant to be governed, not merely occupied. And when governance is absent, something else steps in. Not dramatically, quietly, through patterns, through habits, through normalization, through exhaustion. This is why so many believers feel spiritually tired without understanding why. They are fighting pressure they never recognized as pressure. They are praying generally while attacks operate specifically. And specificity always wins against vagueness. This is not condemnation. It is clarity. There are names that establish order in the unseen the same way laws establish order in nations. Names that do not beg. Names that do not argue. Names that simply state jurisdiction. These names were never meant to be shouted casually or treated superstitiously. They were meant to be understood. And because understanding creates responsibility, most teachings avoid them altogether. It is easier to tell people to pray harder than to pray accurately. It is easier to say, trust God, than to explain how authority actually functions. But authority unused is authority surrendered. And surrendered authority creates space. Space is all darkness ever needed. If I were in your place right now, listening to this for the first time, I would probably feel two things at once. Relief, because something finally makes sense. And discomfort, because it means protection is non-accidental. It is intentional. And intention requires action, not dramatic action. Quiet alignment, consistent awareness, calm authority. The kind that does T-panic when things shake. The kind that understands shaking is often a response, not an initiation. This is why fear is such a useful tool. Fear makes believers loud but inaccurate, emotional but misaligned. And misalignment is the easiest opening there is. I want you to understand something clearly before we go deeper. What I am about to unfold is not hidden knowledge reserved for elites. It has always been present. It was simply deprioritized, overshadowed, labeled unnecessary. And when something becomes unnecessary, it becomes unused. When it becomes unused, it becomes forgotten. And forgotten authority is the safest authority to neutralize. That was always the strategy. Never remove scripture. Just remove understanding. Never stop prayer. Just generalize it. Never attack faith directly. Just distract it. There were moments when I watched entire plans collapse because a household unknowingly invoked the right authority at the right time. No theatrics, no shouting, no ritual, just alignment. Those moments forced me to confront something I could, to ignore anymore. If this authority is real, even when imperfectly understood, then what happens when believers finally understand it fully? That question changed everything. It's why I speak now, not to glorify darkness, but to expose how weak it actually is when faced with informed faith. You don't need to fear what you understand, and you don't need to fight what has no legal access. Protection was never about constant warfare. It was about proper placement. Knowing who governs your household. Knowing which authority is recognized in the unseen. Knowing which names establish boundaries instantly, not eventually. This is not about chanting. It's not about formulas. It is about alignment with structures that already exist. Structures darkness has always been forced to respect, even while pretending they don't matter. As we continue, everything you've experienced that felt random will start forming patterns, not to scare you, but to free you from confusion. Because confusion was always the real weapon, and clarity has always been the real threat. When people hear words like authority, jurisdiction, and strategy, they often imagine something dramatic, almost cinematic. But the truth is far less theatrical and far more disciplined. What I learned during that season of my life is that darkness operates with patience. It observes longer than it acts, it listens more than it speaks, and it almost never moves without precedent. That alone should tell you something important. If something is being resisted consistently, it means that something stronger is already in place. I did understand this at first. In the beginning, I thought power came from intensity, from rituals, from commitment, from secrecy. But over time, I realized that intensity without legitimacy is noise, and noise is easy to bypass. What mattered most was whether access was legally available. Everything revolved around permission, agreement, and unchallenged territory. Homes were never approached randomly. They were assessed. Patterns were mapped. Emotional rhythms were noted. Prayer habits were observed, not to mock them, but to measure their effectiveness. And what stood out to me was how many believers prayed sincerely yet unknowingly left doors open, simply because they had never been taught that doors exist. I remember watching believers blame themselves for things they did T-cause. They assumed hardship meant failure. That pressure meant God was distant. That repeated disruption meant they were doing something wrong. In reality, the opposite was often true. Resistance almost always followed growth. Pressure followed alignment. And disruption followed clarity. The issue was never that attacks happened. The issue was that most people did recognize what stage they were in when it happened. Darkness does chase beginners. It watches builders. It studies households that are becoming stable, because stability creates legacy, and legacy threatens influence. This is why families, not individuals, were always the primary focus. A single believer can be distracted. A household aligned in peace is much harder to destabilize, so the goal was never destruction. It was dilution. Spread the attention thin, create emotional fatigue, introduce small compromises that feel harmless, and above all, keep everything subtle enough that nothing looks intentional. There were times when I was assigned to observe households that seemed protected beyond explanation. No excessive prayer, no loud declarations, just a quiet sense of order. These homes weren't perfect. They argued, they struggled, they failed. Yet something was different. The atmosphere reset faster. Conflicts did T linger. Fear did T take root. It was as if something invisible recalibrated the space whenever tension tried to settle. At first, this frustrated the analysts. We searched for reasons, trauma history, behavioral patterns, spiritual negligence. But none of the usual explanations applied. Eventually, we noticed something consistent. Certain names were spoken naturally, reverently, without performance, not constantly, not obsessively, but with understanding. Those names weren't treated as tools. They were treated as realities. And reality, when acknowledged, enforces itself. This is where trust matters. Because I need you to understand that I am not speaking as someone impressed by darkness. I am speaking as someone who became disillusioned by how unimpressive it actually was once patterns were exposed. Darkness relies heavily on believers misunderstanding their own faith. It thrives in exaggeration, in mystique, in the idea that it is always stronger, always one step ahead. That belief alone gives it leverage. But when authority is properly recognized, that leverage disappears quickly, and nothing unsettles darkness more than losing influence quietly. No confrontation, no resistance, just closed access. That is why distraction is preferred over attack. Because distraction does alert authority. Distraction makes believers abandon to themselves. If I were speaking to you privately without a camera, without an audience, I would tell you this plainly. Most spiritual attacks succeed not because of strength, but because of timing. They arrive when people are tired, busy, emotionally preoccupied. They wait until vigilance drops, and they count on the assumption that nothing significant is happening. That is why understanding matters more than emotion. Emotion fluctuates. Understanding stabilizes, and stability is difficult to disrupt. The homes that resisted most effectively weren't those obsessed with warfare. They were those grounded in order. They did search for enemies. They maintained boundaries. They did react quickly. They responded accurately. That distinction changes everything. At this point, if you're still listening, it tells me something about you. It tells me you're not here for spectacle. You here because something resonates, because you've sensed that faith is deeper than what you were handed, that protection is more intentional than what you were told, and that peace is something that must be stewarded, not assumed. That's exactly why I encourage you again to stay connected here. Not because this channel has all the answers, but because the conversations happening here are the ones most people avoid until they were already overwhelmed. Learning before pressure arrives changes how pressure behaves. Darkness plans ahead. Believers often react late. That imbalance is not spiritual. Informational. And information shifts outcomes. One of the hardest things for me to accept during my transition was realizing how much believers underestimate themselves. They speak about faith as if it's fragile, as if it needs constant defending. But authority does defend itself. It establishes itself. And once established, it does argue. This misunderstanding leads many Christians to exhaust themselves emotionally, thinking intensity equals effectiveness. But effectiveness comes from alignment, from knowing what you carry, from recognizing what you represent in spaces you inhabit. Homes are not neutral environments. They are jurisdictions. They are assigned influence by whoever governs them intentionally. When believers don, govern their homes consciously. Governance does disappear. It transfers, and transferred authority rarely announces itself. It simply operates. I watched strategies fail not because believers fought harder, but because they stopped engaging emotionally and started standing positionally. That shift was always decisive. Emotion invites engagement. Position denies access. When believers understand who governs their space, they stop arguing with pressure and start enforcing boundaries. That enforcement does look dramatic. It looks calm, boring even. But boredom is dangerous for darkness because it means nothing is feeding it. No fear. No fascination, no reaction, just quiet refusal, and refusal grounded in authority is final. What most people never realize is that the dark kingdom does need believers to sin overtly. It only needs them to stay unaware. Awareness activates responsibility. Responsibility activates authority. Authority enforces order. Order eliminates access. That chain reaction is why awareness is always the first thing suppressed. Teach believers to be good but not informed, passionate but not precise. Faithful but not authoritative. That formula has worked for generations until it does And when it stops working, it is never because darkness grew stronger. It is because believers remembered who they were always meant to be. As this unfolds further, you all begin to see why certain struggles repeat while others dissolve quickly. Why some atmospheres feel heavy without cause. Why peace sometimes feels contested rather than natural. None of this is random. And none of it requires fear to address. It requires clarity. The kind of clarity that replaces guessing with understanding. And once understanding takes root, protection stops feeling like something you hope for and starts feeling like something you steward. That shift is subtle, but it changes everything. There comes a moment when understanding shifts from theory into recognition, and recognition carries weight. This is where many people instinctively pull back, not because what they were hearing is false, but because it asks them to rethink how authority actually works. Names in Scripture were never casual identifiers. They were descriptions of function, alignment, and assignment. When God changed a name, identity shifted. When a name was invoked, jurisdiction was acknowledged. This is why names were treated with reverence long before they were treated with familiarity. And this is why the subject of angelic names has been quietly mishandled for generations, either sensationalized to the point of superstition or avoided entirely out of fear. Both extremes miss the point, because this is not about summoning, commanding, or manipulating. It is about recognition. And recognition is not magic. It is agreement with what already exists. During my time observing spiritual dynamics, the most common error believers made was assuming that acknowledging angelic authority somehow diminished God, sovereignty. In reality, it did the opposite. Angels were never independent powers. They were extensions of divine order, ministers, not monarchs, executors, not originators. When believers understood that, fear disappeared. When they did, confusion filled the gap. The dark kingdom benefited from that confusion immensely, because when believers avoid what they don't understand, they leave whole dimensions of God as order unacknowledged. And what is unacknowledged is rarely enforced. That is not a mystical principle. It is a legal one. Even in human systems, authority unrecognized goes unused. There are 3 angelic names that consistently altered environments, not because they were spoken frequently, but because they were spoken with understanding. The first is Michael. Most people know Michael as a warrior, but few understand what that actually means. Michael's role was never about aggression. It was about defense of divine order. He is associated with boundaries, resistance, and protection against unlawful intrusion. When Michael's name is acknowledged in alignment with God's authority, it does not invite conflict. It establishes perimeter. This is why environments shifted when his role was understood correctly. Not because someone was calling for battle, but because they were affirming governance. Darkness respects governance. It has to. It operates illegally by nature, which means it must retreat when legality is enforced. Michael represents that enforcement. Not through noise, through presence. I saw households where fear attempted to linger and simply could teach. Tension would rise, arguments would start, confusion would press in, and then something would stabilize the space. Not instantly, but decisively. When we traced it back, it wasn't emotional prayer or frantic declarations. It was calm acknowledgement. A recognition that this space was not unguarded, that this household was not unattended, that divine order was not absent. Michael's name was never treated like a weapon. It was treated like a fact. And facts don't negotiate. They assert themselves naturally. That distinction matters more than people realize. The second name is Gabriel. Gabriel's role has always been tied to revelation, clarity, and the delivery of divine intent. Where Michael establishes boundary, Gabriel restores understanding. This is crucial because confusion is one of the most effective tools darkness uses. Confusion does feel evil. It feels overwhelming. It clouds judgment, disrupts communication, and weakens unity. When Gabriel's role is acknowledged, clarity begins to surface, not necessarily answers to everything, but alignment to what matters. This is why Gabriel appears in moments where understanding shifts history, because clarity changes decisions. Decisions change outcomes, and outcomes change environments. In households where communication broke down easily, where misunderstandings escalated quickly, where peace felt fragile, acknowledgement of Gabriel's role shifted the atmosphere subtly but profoundly. Conversations slowed, reactions softened, discernment increased. It was emotional manipulation. It was mental alignment. When clarity enters, confusion loses its grip. Darkness thrives in fog. Gabriel clears fog. That is not symbolic language. That is functional reality. When people stop reacting and start discerning, influence shifts immediately. The third name is Raphael. Raphael is often misunderstood or ignored entirely, yet his role is deeply tied to healing and restoration. Not only physical, but relational, emotional, and environmental. Healing is not always dramatic. Often it's gradual reordering, repairing what was fractured, strengthening what was weakened, restoring balance where imbalance was normalized. Darkness hates healing, not because it removes pain, but because it restores function. A healed household functions better, it communicates better, it resists better, and it reproduces peace naturally. That makes it resilient. I observed households where exhaustion seemed chronic, where emotional fatigue lingered even without obvious cause, where peace felt temporary. When Raphael's role was acknowledged, restoration began quietly. Rest patterns improved. Emotional resilience increased, tension released, not because problems vanished, but because strength returned. Darkness relies heavily on depletion. Depleted people don to resist well. Restored people do. Raphael represents restoration of capacity, and capacity determines resistance more than intensity ever will. What is important to understand is that these names are not formulas. They are acknowledgments of roles within a hierarchy that already exists. When believers speak these names with understanding, they are not commanding angels. They are aligning with divine order. That alignment enforces itself. Darkness does not fear shouting, it fears alignment, because alignment removes its leverage. There is nothing to manipulate when order is recognized. If I were in your place, hearing this for the first time, I would rush to start saying names casually. I would slow down. I would focus on understanding what authority actually means. I would recognize that my home is not just a physical space, but a spiritual jurisdiction. And I would become intentional about who governs it. Not emotionally, positionally. I would stop asking God to do what he has already delegated authority to establish. And I would start stewarding what was entrusted. This is where many believers struggle, because stewardship feels heavier than prayer requests. It requires presence, awareness, responsibility. But stewardship is where peace becomes stable instead of temporary. It's where protection becomes consistent instead of reactive. When households recognize divine order, they stop living in cycles of confusion. Patterns break, not magically, legally. Darkness does not retreat because it is afraid. It retreats because it has no standing. And standing is everything. The more believers understand this, the less dramatic their faith becomes and the more effective it is. Calm replaces panic. Clarity replaces confusion, authority replaces fear, and fear was always the fuel that kept people running in circles. As this continues to unfold, you will begin to recognize moments in your own life where pressure was never meant to defeat you, only distract you from using what you already carried. You will see why some prayers felt unanswered, while others shifted everything quietly, and you will realize that protection was never something you lacked, it was something waiting to be acknowledged. By the time most believers start asking why certain pressures keep returning, the pattern has already been established. That is not said to discourage you, but to wake you up to something important. Repetition is rarely random. It is a signal. Not that something is overpowering you, but that something is testing whether resistance will ever appear. The Dark Kingdom never assumes victory. It probes. It observes. It waits to see what is tolerated, what is ignored, what is excused. Because what is tolerated today becomes normalized tomorrow. And normalization is the quietest form of surrender there is. Most households never lose peace all at once. They leak it slowly, through exhaustion, through unresolved tension, through constant noise that feels harmless until silence feels unfamiliar. That is how influence settles in. Not with force, but with permission disguised as routine. One of the most effective strategies was never to introduce something new, but to distort what already existed. Prayer becomes rushed. Rest becomes optional. Communication becomes transactional. Presence becomes fragmented. None of these feel dangerous on their own. But together they thin the atmosphere, and a thin atmosphere is easy to penetrate. Darkness never needs to create storms when it can simply weaken foundation. That is why the most common entry points were not trauma or crisis, but fatigue and distraction. People underestimate how powerful tiredness is. Tired people do not govern well. They react. They postpone. They overlook. And overlooked boundaries stay closed for long. I watched believers search endlessly for dramatic causes when the issue was always subtle erosion. They asked why peace felt unstable, why joy faded quickly, why unity required so much effort. They assumed something external was attacking them aggressively. In reality, something internal had been left unattended consistently, not through rebellion, through busyness, through misplaced priorities, through the belief that spiritual maintenance could wait. The Dark Kingdom counts on that delay. It does rush outcomes. It extends processes, because extended processes feel natural. And what feels natural rarely gets challenged. This is where turning the table begins, and it's far less dramatic than people expect. It doesn't start with confrontation. It starts with recognition that not every battle needs to be fought, because many were never battles to begin with. They were invitations to disengage from authority. Once that recognition settles, behavior shifts naturally. People stop reacting emotionally and start responding positionally. They stop asking why something is happening and start asking whether it has permission. That question alone disrupts most strategies, because permission is fragile. It exists only as long as it goes unquestioned. When believers begin governing their households intentionally, the atmosphere changes first. Not circumstances, atmosphere. Peace becomes easier to return to. Clarity arrives faster. Tension loses momentum. Arguments de-escalate the way they used to. That is not coincidence. That is order reasserting itself. Darkness doesn't need to be expelled dramatically when it can no longer influence quietly. Influence requires engagement. Engagement requires attention. And attention is withdrawn when authority is present. One of the clear signs that alignment has shifted is when fear loses its voice. Not because nothing ever goes wrong, but because wrong no longer feels threatening. Problems become manageable instead of overwhelming. Decisions feel clearer. Sleep improves. Rest deepens. These are not emotional highs. They are indicators of restored function, and restored function is always more dangerous to darkness than emotional intensity. Intensity burns out. Function sustains. If I were standing where you are now, having listened to this from beginning to end, I would feel fear. I would feel sober, grounded, alert in a calm way. Because this knowledge does call you to panic. It calls you to maturity, to stop living as if peace is fragile and start living as if it is enforceable, to stop hoping your household is protected and start stewarding its protection consciously, not obsessively, not anxiously, intentionally. That distinction matters. Obsession creates pressure. Intention creates stability. The Dark Kingdom's plans were never as impressive as people imagine. They relied heavily on believers never realizing how much authority they already carried. Once that realization happens, strategies lose effectiveness quickly. Distraction fails. Confusion dissolves. Fatigue lifts gradually. Not because life becomes perfect, but because governance returns. And governance changes how life is experienced. When authority is in place, problems don't disappear, but they stop multiplying. This is why sharing this matters. Not because everyone is under attack, but because everyone is responsible for the atmosphere they live in. And most people were never taught that. They were taught to endure, to cope, to survive spiritually. But survival was never the goal. Stewardship was. Households were meant to be places of rest, clarity, and strength, not battlegrounds. And when they function that way, influence shifts naturally outward. Peace spreads. Stability multiplies. Legacy forms. That is what truly threatens darkness, not loud resistance, quiet consistency. If this understanding has settled something in you, if it has brought clarity instead of fear, then you already know this is not something to keep to yourself. Not because of urgency driven by panic, but because awareness shared creates resilience multiplied. Stay connected. Stay attentive. Not to darkness, but to order. Because when order is restored, darkness doesn't need to be chased away. It simply has nowhere left to stand.